Book 2, Chapter 24. They lunched slowly and meditatively, with mute intervals between rushes of talk, for, the spell once broken, they had much to say, and yet moments when saying became the mere accompaniment to long dialogues of silence. Archer kept the talk from his own affairs, not with conscious intention, but because he did not want to miss a word of her history, and leaning on the table, her chin resting on her clasped hands, she talked to him of the year and a half since they had met. She had grown tired of what people called society. New York was kind, it was almost oppressively hospitable. She should never forget the way in which it had welcomed her back. But after the first flush of novelty she had found herself, as she phrased it, too different to care for the things it cared about. And so she had decided to try Washington, where one was supposed to meet more varieties of people and of opinion. And on the whole, she should probably settle down in Washington and make a home there for poor Medora, who had worn out the patience of all her other relations just at the time when she most needed looking after and protecting from matrimonial perils. "But Dr. Carver, aren't you afraid of Dr. Carver? I hear he's been staying with you at the Blenkers." She smiled. "Oh, the Carver danger is over. Dr. Carver is a very clever man. He wants a rich wife to finance his plans, and Medora is simply a good advertisement as a convert." "A convert to what?" "To all sorts of new and crazy social schemes. But, do you know, they interest me more than the blind conformity to tradition, somebody else's tradition, that I see among our own friends. It seems stupid to have discovered America only to make it a copy of another country." She smiled across the table. "Do you suppose Christopher Columbus would have taken all that trouble just to go to the opera with the Selfridge Marys?" Archer changed color. "And Beaufort. Do you say these things to Beaufort?" he asked abruptly. "I haven't seen him for a long time, but I used to, and he understands." "Ah, it's what I've always told you. You don't like us, and you like Beaufort because he's so unlike us." He looked about the bare room and out at the bare beach and the row of stark white village houses strung along the shore. "We're damnably dull. We've no character, no color, no variety. I wonder," he broke out, "why you don't go back." Her eyes darkened, and he expected an indignant rejoinder. But she sat silent, as if thinking over what he had said, and he grew frightened lest she should answer that she wondered too. At length she said, "I believe it's because of you." It was impossible to make the confession more dispassionately, or in a tone less encouraging to the vanities of the person addressed. Archer reddened to the temples, but dared not move or speak. It was as if her words had been some rare butterfly that the least motion might drive off on startled wings, but that might gather a flock about it if it were left undisturbed. "At least," she continued, "it was you who made me understand that under the dullness there are things so fine and sensitive and delicate that even those I most cared for in my other life look cheap in comparison. I don't know how to explain myself." She drew together her troubled brows. "But it seems as if I'd never before understood with how much that is hard and shabby and base the most exquisite pleasures may be paid." "Exquisite pleasures, it's something to have had them," he felt like retorting, but the appeal in her eyes kept him silent. "I want," she went on, "to be perfectly honest with you, and with myself. For a long time I've hoped this chance would come, that I might tell you how you've helped me, what you've made of me." Archer sat staring beneath frowning brows. He interrupted her with a laugh. "And what do you make out that you've made of me?" She paled a little. "Of you?" "Yes, for I'm of your making much more than you ever were of mine. I'm the man who married one woman because another one told him to." Her paleness turned to a fugitive flush. "I thought you promised you were not to say such things today." "Ah, how like a woman! None of you will ever see a bad business through." She lowered her voice. "Is this a bad business for May?" He stood at the window, drumming against the raised sash, and feeling in every fiber the wistful tenderness with which she had spoken her cousin's name. "For that's the thing we've always got to think of, haven't we, by your own showing?" she insisted. "My own showing," he echoed, his blank eyes still on the sea. "Or if not," she continued, pursuing her own thought with a painful application, "if it's not worth while to have given up, to have missed things, so that others may be saved from disillusionment and misery, then everything I came home for, everything that made my other life seem, by contrast, so bare and so poor, because no one there took account of them, all these things are a sham or a dream." He turned around without moving from his place. "And in that case there's no reason on earth why you shouldn't go back," he concluded for her. Her eyes were clinging to him desperately. "Oh, is there no reason?" "Not if you staked your all on the success of my marriage. My marriage," he said savagely, "isn't going to be a sight to keep you here." She made no answer, and he went on. "What's the use? You gave me my first glimpse of a real life, and at the same moment you asked me to go on with a sham one. It's beyond human enduring, that's all." "Oh, don't say that, when I'm enduring it," she burst out, her eyes filling. Her arms had dropped along the table, and she sat with her face abandoned to his gaze as if in the recklessness of a desperate peril. The face exposed her as much as if it had been her whole person, with the soul behind it. Archer stood dumb, overwhelmed by what it suddenly told him. "You too? Oh, all this time you too?" For answer she let the tears on her lids overflow and run slowly downward. Half the width of the room was still between them, and neither made any show of moving. Archer was conscious of a curious indifference to her bodily presence. He would hardly have been aware of it if one of the hands she had flung out on the table had not drawn his gaze, as on the occasion when, in the little 23rd Street house, he had kept his eye on it in order not to look at her face. Now his imagination spun about the hand as about the edge of a vortex, but still he made no effort to draw nearer. He had known the love that is fed on caresses and feeds them, but this passion that was closer than his bones was not to be superficially satisfied. His one terror was to do anything which might efface the sound and impression of her words, his one thought, that he should never again feel quite alone. But after a moment the sense of waste and ruin overcame him. There they were, close together and safe and shut in, yet so chained to their separate destinies that they might as well have been half the world apart. "What's the use, when you will go back?" he broke out, a great hopeless "How on earth can I keep you?" crying out to her beneath his words. She sat motionless with lowered lids. "Oh, I shan't go yet." "Not yet? Some time, then? Some time that you already foresee?" To that she raised her clearest eyes. "I promise you, not as long as you hold out, not as long as we can look straight at each other like this." He dropped into his chair. What her answer really said was, "If you lift a finger you'll drive me back to all the abominations you know of and all the temptations you half guess." He understood it as clearly as if she had uttered the words, and the thought kept him anchored to his side of the table in a kind of moved and sacred submission. "What a life for you!" he groaned. "Oh, as long as it's a part of yours." "And mine a part of yours?" She nodded. "And that's to be all for either of us?" "Well, it is all, isn't it?" At that he sprang up, forgetting everything but the sweetness of her face. She rose, too, not as if to meet him or to flee from him, but quietly, as though the worst of the task were done and she had only to wait. So quietly that, as he came close, her outstretched hands acted not as a check, but as a guide to him. They fell into his, while her arms, extended but not rigid, kept him far enough off to let her surrendered face say the rest. They may have stood in that way for a long time, or only for a few moments, but it was long enough for her silence to communicate all she had to say, and for him to feel that only one thing mattered. He must do nothing to make this meeting their last. He must leave their future in her care, asking only that she should keep fast hold of it. Don't be unhappy," she said, with a break in her voice, as she drew her hands away, and he answered, "You won't go back? You won't go back?" as if it were the one possibility he could not bear. "I won't go back," she said, and turning away she opened the door and led the way into the public dining room. The strident school teachers were gathering up their possessions preparatory to a straggling flight to the wharf. Across the beach lay the white steamboat at the pier, and over the sunlit waters Boston loomed in a line of haze. Book 2, Chapter 25. Once more on the boat, and in the presence of others, Archer felt a tranquillity of spirit that surprised as much as it sustained him. The day, according to any current valuation, had been a rather ridiculous failure. He had not so much as touched Madame Olenska's hand with his lips, or extracted one word from her that gave promise of farther opportunities. Nevertheless, for a man sick with unsatisfied love, and parting for an indefinite period from the object of his passion, he felt himself almost humiliatingly calm and comforted. It was the perfect balance she had held between their loyalty to others and their honesty to themselves that had so stirred and yet tranquilized him. A balance not artfully calculated, as her tears and her falterings showed, but resulting naturally from her unabashed sincerity. It filled him with a tender awe now the danger was over, and made him thank the fates that no personal vanity, no sense of playing a part before sophisticated witnesses, had tempted him to tempt her. Even after they had clasped hands for goodbye at the Fall River station, and he had turned away alone, the conviction remained with him of having saved out of their meeting much more than he had sacrificed. He wandered back to the club and went and sat alone in the deserted library, turning and turning over in his thoughts every separate second of their hours together. It was clear to him, and it grew more clear under closer scrutiny, that if she should finally decide on returning to Europe, returning to her husband, it would not be because her old life tempted her, even on the new terms offered. No, she would go only if she felt herself becoming a temptation to Archer, a temptation to fall away from the standard they had both set up. Her choice would be to stay near him as long as he did not ask her to come nearer, and it depended on himself to keep her just there, safe but secluded. In the train these thoughts were still with him. They enclosed him in a kind of golden haze, through which the faces about him looked remote and indistinct. He had a feeling that if he spoke to his fellow travelers, they would not understand what he was saying. In this state of abstraction he found himself, the following morning, waking to the reality of a stifling September day in New York. The heat-withered faces in the long train streamed past him, and he continued to stare at them through the same golden blur. But suddenly, as he left the station, one of the faces detached itself, came closer, and forced itself upon his consciousness. It was, as he instantly recalled, the face of the young man he had seen the day before passing out of the Parker House, and had noted as not conforming to type, as not having an American hotel face. The same thing struck him now, and again he became aware of a dim stir of former associations. The young man stood looking about him with the dazed air of the foreigner flung upon the harsh mercies of American travel. Then he advanced toward Archer, lifted his hat, and said in English, "Surely, monsieur, we met in London?" "Ah, to be sure, in London!" Archer grasped his hand with curiosity and sympathy. "So you did get here after all!" he exclaimed, casting a wondering eye on the astute and haggard little countenance of young Carfry's French tutor. "Oh, I got here, yes," Monsieur Riviere smiled with drawn lips, "but not for long. I return the day after tomorrow." He stood grasping his light valise in one neatly gloved hand, and gazing anxiously, perplexedly, almost appealingly into Archer's face. I wonder, monsieur, since I've had the good luck to run across you, if I might— I was just going to suggest it. Come to luncheon, won't you? Downtown, I mean. If you'll look me up at my office, I'll take you to a very decent restaurant in that quarter." Monsieur Riviere was visibly touched and surprised. "You're too kind, but I was only going to ask if you would tell me how to reach some sort of conveyance. There are no porters, and no one here seems to listen. I know, our American stations must surprise you. When you ask for a porter, they give you chewing gum. But if you'll come along, I'll extricate you, and you must really lunch with me, you know." The young man, after a just perceptible hesitation, replied with profuse thanks, and in a tone that did not carry complete conviction, that he was already engaged. But when they had reached the comparative reassurance of the street, he asked if he might call that afternoon. Archer, at ease in the midsummer leisure of the office, fixed an hour and scribbled his address, which the Frenchman pocketed with reiterated thanks and a wide flourish of his hat. A horse-car received him, and Archer walked away. Punctually at the hour, Monsieur Riviere appeared, shaved, smoothed out, but still unmistakably drawn and serious. Archer was alone in his office, and the young man, before accepting the seat he proffered, began abruptly, "I believe I saw you, sir, yesterday in Boston." The statement was insignificant enough, and Archer was about to frame an assent when his words were checked by something mysterious yet illuminating in his visitor's insistent gaze. "It is extraordinary, very extraordinary," Monsieur Riviere continued, "that we should have met in the circumstances in which I find myself." "What circumstances?" Archer asked, wondering a little crudely if he needed money. Monsieur Riviere continued to study him with tentative eyes. "I have come, not to look for employment, as I spoke of doing when we last met, but on a special mission." "Ah!" Archer exclaimed. In a flash the two meetings had connected themselves in his mind. He paused to take in the situation thus suddenly lighted up for him, and Monsieur Riviere also remained silent as if aware that what he had said was enough. "A special mission," Archer at length repeated. The young Frenchman, opening his palms, raised them slightly, and the two men continued to look at each other across the office desk till Archer roused himself to say, "Do sit down," whereupon Monsieur Riviere bowed, took a distant chair, and again waited. "It was about this mission that you wanted to consult me?" Archer finally asked. Monsieur Riviere bent his head. "Not in my own behalf. On that score I have fully dealt with myself. I should like, if I may, to speak to you about the Countess Olenska." Archer had known for the last few minutes that the words were coming, but when they came they sent the blood rushing to his temples as if he had been caught by a bent-back branch in a thicket. "And on whose behalf," he said, "do you wish to do this?" Monsieur Riviere met the question sturdily. "Well, I might say hers, if it did not sound like a liberty. Shall I say instead, on behalf of abstract justice?" Archer considered him ironically. "In other words, you are Count Olenski's messenger?" He saw his blush more darkly reflected in Monsieur Riviere's sallow countenance. "Not to you, monsieur. If I come to you, it is on quite other grounds." "What right have you in the circumstances to be on any other ground?" Archer retorted. "If you're an emissary, you're an emissary." The young man considered. "My mission is over as far as the Countess Olenska goes. It has failed." "I can't help that," Archer rejoined on the same note of irony. "No, but you can help." Monsieur Riviere paused, turned his hat about in his still carefully gloved hands, looked into its lining, and then back at Archer's face. "You can help, monsieur, I am convinced, to make it equally a failure with her family." Archer pushed back his chair and stood up. "Well, and by God I will!" he exclaimed. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring down wrathfully at the little Frenchman, whose face, though he too had risen, was still an inch or two below the line of Archer's eyes. Monsieur Riviere paled to his normal hue. Paler than that his complexion could hardly turn. Why the devil, Archer explosively continued, should you have thought, since I suppose you're appealing to me on the ground of my relationship to Madame Olenska, that I should take a view contrary to the rest of her family? The change of expression in Monsieur Riviere's face was for a time his only answer. His look passed from timidity to absolute distress. For a young man of his usually resourceful mien, it would have been difficult to appear more disarmed and defenseless. "Oh, monsieur, I can't imagine," Archer continued, "why you should have come to me when there are others so much nearer to the Countess. Still less why you thought I should be more accessible to the arguments I suppose you were sent over with." Monsieur Riviere took this onslaught with a disconcerting humility. "The arguments I want to present to you, monsieur, are my own, and not those I was sent over with." "Then I see still less reason for listening to them." Monsieur Riviere again looked into his hat, as if considering whether these last words were not a sufficiently broad hint to put it on and be gone. Then he spoke with sudden decision. "Monsieur, will you tell me one thing? Is it my right to be here that you question, or do you perhaps believe the whole matter to be already closed?" His quiet insistence made Archer feel the clumsiness of his own bluster. Monsieur Riviere had succeeded in imposing himself. Archer, reddening slightly, dropped into his chair again, and signed to the young man to be seated. "I beg your pardon, but why isn't the matter closed?" Monsieur Riviere gazed back at him with anguish. "You do, then, agree with the rest of the family that, in face of the new proposals I have brought, it is hardly possible for Madame Olenska not to return to her husband?" "Good God!" Archer exclaimed, and his visitor gave out a low murmur of confirmation. "Before seeing her, I saw, at Count Olenski's request, Mr. Lovell Mingott, with whom I had several talks before going to Boston. I understand that he represents his mother's view, and that Mrs. Manson Mingott's influence is great throughout her family." Archer sat silent, with the sense of clinging to the edge of a sliding precipice. The discovery that he had been excluded from a share in these negotiations, and even from the knowledge that they were on foot, caused him a surprise hardly dulled by the acuter wonder of what he was learning. He saw in a flash that if the family had ceased to consult him, it was because some deep tribal instinct warned them that he was no longer on their side, and he recalled, with a start of comprehension, a remark of May's during their drive home from Mrs. Manson Mingott's on the day of the archery meeting. Perhaps, after all, Ellen would be happier with her husband. Even in the tumult of new discoveries, Archer remembered his indignant exclamation, and the fact that since then his wife had never named Madame Olenska to him. Her careless allusion had no doubt been the straw held up to see which way the wind blew. The result had been reported to the family, and thereafter Archer had been tacitly omitted from their councils. He admired the tribal discipline which made May bow to this decision. She would not have done so, he knew, had her conscience protested, but she probably shared the family view that Madame Olenska would be better off as an unhappy wife than as a separated one, and that there was no use in discussing the case with Newland, who had an awkward way of suddenly not seeming to take the most fundamental things for granted. Archer looked up and met his visitor's anxious gaze. "Don't you know, monsieur, it is possible you don't know, that the family begin to doubt if they have the right to advise the Countess to refuse her husband's last proposals?" "The proposals you brought?" "The proposals I brought." It was on Archer's lips to exclaim that whatever he knew or did not know was no concern of Monsieur Riviere's, but something in the humble and yet courageous tenacity of Monsieur Riviere's gaze made him reject this conclusion, and he met the young man's question with another. "What is your object in speaking to me of this?" He had not to wait a moment for the answer. "To beg you, monsieur, to beg you with all the force I'm capable of, not to let her go back. Oh, don't let her!" Monsieur Riviere exclaimed. Archer looked at him with increasing astonishment. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his distress or the strength of his determination. He had evidently resolved to let everything go by the board but the supreme need of thus putting himself on record. Archer considered. "May I ask," he said at length, "if this is the line you took with the Countess Olenska?" Monsieur Riviere reddened, but his eyes did not falter. "No, monsieur. I accepted my mission in good faith. I really believed, for reasons I need not trouble you with, that it would be better for Madame Olenska to recover her situation, her fortune, the social consideration that her husband's standing gives her. So I supposed you could hardly have accepted such a mission otherwise." "I should not have accepted it." "Well, then—" Archer paused again, and their eyes met in another protracted scrutiny. "Ah, monsieur, after I had seen her, after I had listened to her, I knew she was better off here." "You knew?" "Monsieur, I discharged my mission faithfully. I put the Count's arguments, I stated his offers, without adding any comment of my own. The Countess was good enough to listen patiently. She carried her goodness so far as to see me twice. She considered impartially all I had come to say. And it was in the course of these 2 talks that I changed my mind, that I came to see things differently." "May I ask what led to this change?" "Simply seeing the change in her," Monsieur Riviere replied. "The change in her? Then you knew her before?" The young man's color again rose. "I used to see her in her husband's house. I have known Count Olenski for many years. You can imagine that he would not have sent a stranger on such a mission." Archer's gaze, wandering away to the blank walls of the office, rested on a hanging calendar surmounted by the rugged features of the President of the United States. That such a conversation should be going on anywhere within the millions of square miles subject to his rule seemed as strange as anything that the imagination could invent. The change. What sort of a change? "Ah, monsieur, if I could tell you—" Monsieur Riviere paused. "Tenez, the discovery, I suppose, of what I'd never thought of before, that she's an American. And that if you're an American of her kind, of your kind, things that are accepted in certain other societies, or at least put up with as part of a general convenient give and take, become unthinkable, simply unthinkable. If Madame Olenska's relations understood what these things were, their opposition to her returning would no doubt be as unconditional as her own. But they seem to regard her husband's wish to have her back as proof of an irresistible longing for domestic life." Monsieur Riviere paused, and then added, "Whereas it's far from being as simple as that." Archer looked back to the President of the United States, and then down at his desk, and at the papers scattered on it. For a second or two he could not trust himself to speak. During this interval he heard Monsieur Riviere's chair pushed back, and was aware that the young man had risen. When he glanced up again he saw that his visitor was as moved as himself. "Thank you," Archer said simply. "There's nothing to thank me for, monsieur. It is I, rather—" Monsieur Riviere broke off, as if speech for him, too, were difficult. "I should like, though," he continued in a firmer voice, "to add one thing. You asked me if I was in Count Olenski's employ. I am at this moment. I returned to him a few months ago for reasons of private necessity such as may happen to anyone who has persons, ill or older persons, dependent on them. But from the moment that I have taken the step of coming here to say these things to you, I consider myself discharged, and I shall tell him so on my return, and give him the reasons. That's all, monsieur." Monsieur Riviere bowed and drew back a step. "Thank you," Archer said again, as their hands met.